Hey guys, tonight we walk somewhere quiet. Not a place exactly. More like a state of mind you've been meaning to return to for a while now. A slower pace. A softer inner voice. The kind of stillness that doesn't demand anything from you. You've probably spent a lot of today managing things. Managing your thoughts, your reactions, your schedule, the way you came across in that conversation you keep replaying. You've been holding a lot together, and maybe, just beneath the surface of all that holding, there's been this low hum, this persistent, uninvited anxiety that followed you through your day like a shadow that doesn't quite match your movements. And here you are, in the dark, or nearly dark, with a little quiet finally around you. That's not nothing. That's actually everything tonight needs. This video is going to take you somewhere. Not somewhere dramatic or life-changing in the loud, obvious way. More like the slow return to something you already know but keep forgetting in the noise of being alive. We're going to walk through some of the oldest, most quietly powerful ideas human beings have ever thought. Ideas that were written in candlelight, in courtyard shade, in the margins of empires. And we're going to let them do what they were always meant to do. Help you breathe. Help you release. Help you sleep. Because here's the thing. Anxiety is not a modern invention. It just has a modern costume now. Notifications and news. Cycles and the particular dread of reading a message and not knowing how to respond. But the core of it, the raw middle of it, is as ancient as thought itself. And the people who understood it best didn't have therapists or productivity apps. They had philosophy, they had patience, and they had the night. Which, to be fair, is exactly what you have right now. And no, your overthinking is not as deep as it thinks it is. That's not an insult. That's actually the most relieving thing anyone can tell you. Because somewhere under all that spiraling and second-guessing and catastrophizing is just a very human creature who wants to feel safe, who wants to rest, who wants, more than anything, for the internal noise to please, gently, stop for a few hours. That creature deserves tonight. There's a version of you that existed before the anxiety had a name. Before you understood what stress was. Before the world handed you its list of things to worry about. That version of you is not gone. It's not buried beyond reach. It's just been waiting, very patiently, for a night like this one, when the lights are low and there's nowhere else to be and someone is speaking, slowly enough that your nervous system finally gets the memo. We are going to cover a lot of ground tonight. Ancient wisdom from the Stoics, from the Buddhists, from the quiet corners of Taoist thought. We're going to look at the nature of the anxious mind with real honesty. Not the kind of honesty that makes you feel worse, but the kind that feels like finally being understood. We're going to sit with some uncomfortable truths that are, paradoxically, enormously comforting once they settle. And somewhere along the way, if everything goes the way it tends to on nights like this one, you're going to feel yourself relax in a way that isn't forced or performed. Just real, just quiet, just yours. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with your country and your local time. There's something I genuinely love about knowing that someone in New Zealand at 2 in the morning, and someone in Portugal at midnight, and someone in Canada at 11 at night are all here, in this same gentle dark, together. It makes the whole thing feel less lonely, which, as it turns out, is one of the oldest remedies for anxiety ever discovered. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You have been carrying something. You may not even have a precise name for it. It sits somewhere between your chest and your throat, and it has a way of becoming loudest exactly when you want it to be quiet. At night, in the stillness. When the distractions are gone and the mind, with nowhere left to run, turns back toward itself. This is not a flaw. This is not evidence that something has gone wrong with you. This is what the mind does when it is alive and alert and, underneath everything, deeply invested in your survival. But investment and peace are not the same thing. And tonight, gently, carefully, without forcing anything, we begin to learn the difference. The ancients had a phrase for this moment. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet recognition that the examined life begins not in the library or the lecture hall, but in the small hours of the night when the soul finally stops performing and starts listening. You're already here. That's the first thing. You didn't have to do anything heroic. You just had to show up in the dark, which you've done, and which counts for more than you know. Something deeper is waiting just ahead. Not loud, not urgent, just waiting, the way all worthwhile things tend to wait, with complete and unhurried patience. There is a specific kind of suffering that lives just underneath the version of yourself. You show the world not the obvious kind, not the kind you describe to a doctor or mention in a conversation when someone asks how you're doing. This is quieter than that, more personal. It's the feeling that hums in the background when you wake up at 3 in the morning and can't locate a specific reason why. It's the low-grade unease that follows you through ordinary moments. A perfectly fine Tuesday afternoon. A meal you didn't quite taste. A conversation you were physically present for, but mentally somewhere else entirely. This is the anxiety that nobody talks about honestly. Not because it's too shameful, but because it's too slippery. Too hard to hold up to the light and name clearly. It doesn't always arrive with a cause. It doesn't always leave when the cause goes away. It just exists, like weather, like background static on a frequency. Your nervous system never fully tunes out. And here is what makes it particularly exhausting. You've probably tried to think your way out of it, analyzed it, researched it, made mental lists of reasons you should not feel this way. You have a roof over your head, people who care about you, a life that, measured against the vast scale of human suffering throughout history, is genuinely not so bad. And yet, the anxiety doesn't read your list. It doesn't respond to logical arguments. It simply continues, unmoved, like a cat that has decided to sit exactly where it wants and has no interest in your opinion, which is, to be fair, deeply inconvenient for the part of you that believes thinking harder is always the answer. The ancient Stoics understood something about this that took modern psychology centuries to rediscover. They noticed that the suffering most people carry is not caused by what is actually happening to them. It is caused by the conversation happening inside them about what is happening to them. Epictetus, a man who was literally born into slavery and still managed to develop one of the most psychologically liberating philosophies ever recorded, put it plainly. It is not things that disturb us, he said, but our judgments about things now. Before that starts to sound like a dismissal, like someone telling you your pain isn't real. Sit with it for a moment in a different way. He wasn't saying your anxiety is imaginary. He was saying something far more interesting. He was saying that the machinery producing your suffering is internal, which means, unlike the external world, it is actually something you can work with, but the working with it is nothing like what you'd expect. It is not a battle. It is not a productivity system. It is something much quieter, something much older. Here is what people rarely notice about anxiety. It is almost never about the present moment. Genuinely, actually, right now, in this breath, almost nothing is wrong. The thing anxiety is reacting to is nearly always a thought about a future that hasn't arrived, or a memory of a past that cannot be changed, or a story about what other people think of you that exists entirely inside your own mind and has never been verified. Anxiety lives in time. It is a creature of the past and the future, and the present moment is, almost always, its natural enemy. The Buddhists mapped this territory with extraordinary precision. They described the anxious mind as a mind caught in what they called the second arrow. The first arrow is the painful thing that happens, the difficult circumstance, the loss, the uncertainty. The second arrow is the one you shoot at yourself in response, the self-blame, the catastrophizing, the desperate mental scrambling, the layer of suffering you add on top of suffering, and the uncomfortable truth, the one that is easy to hear but hard to genuinely absorb, is that most of the pain you carry right now is second arrow pain. The first arrow may have already landed, but you've been reaching for the second one over and over again, every night, with enormous dedication and very little sleep to show for it. There is something almost tender about recognizing this, not because it makes the pain smaller, exactly, but because it makes it more understandable. You are not broken. You are not uniquely afflicted. You are doing exactly what the human mind has always done, trying to protect itself from an uncertain world by thinking about it relentlessly, which is, unfortunately, one of the least effective protection strategies ever developed by an otherwise impressive species. Every restless mind throughout history has done this. The Roman emperor who couldn't stop worrying about the barbarians at the border. The monk in the monastery who couldn't stop worrying about whether his faith was genuine. The philosopher in ancient Athens who couldn't stop worrying about death. The medieval farmer who couldn't stop worrying about the harvest. The shape of the worry changes across centuries. The mechanism never does. You are part of this long, human, beautifully imperfect lineage, and somewhere in recognizing that, somewhere in realizing that this thing you carry tonight is not a personal failure, but a deeply shared feature of conscious existence, there is the faintest beginning of relief. Not resolution, not cure, just the first soft exhale of feeling genuinely, historically understood. The question that follows from all of this, though, is a real one. If the machinery is internal, if it runs largely on thought and story and the endless recycling of past and future, then what is actually driving it at such a deep level? What is underneath the anxiety that makes the mind so committed to generating it? That question lives in the next layer down, and it is stranger and more illuminating than you might expect. Let's go a little deeper now. Not in a way that requires effort, just in the way that happens naturally when you stop resisting the dark and let your eyes adjust to it. The room hasn't changed. You have just started to see it more clearly. The question from a moment ago is still here. What is actually underneath the anxiety? What is the mind so desperately protecting when it runs those loops at 2 a.m, when it replays that conversation from 3 days ago, when it conjures catastrophic futures with the creative energy of a novelist who never sleeps? Here is the honest answer, and it is one that psychology and philosophy have both arrived at, from different directions across very different centuries. The mind that cannot rest is almost always a mind that does not feel safe. Not physically unsafe, in most cases. Existentially unsafe. There is a part of you, a very old, very fundamental part that is perpetually scanning the horizon for threats. That is, rehearsing worst-case scenarios, not because it enjoys the experience, but because it believes, somewhere beneath language, that if it thinks about the bad thing enough, it will be prepared for it when it comes. This is not a character flaw. This is an inheritance. The human nervous system was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years, in environments where this kind of vigilance was genuinely useful, where threats were physical and immediate, and the mind that stayed alert, that anticipated danger, that never fully relaxed, was the mind most likely to survive the night. The problem, of course, is that the threats have changed almost completely, but the system has not received the update. Your nervous system cannot reliably distinguish between a predator in the grass and an unanswered email, between a physical emergency and a difficult conversation you need to have next week. It responds to both with the same ancient, exhausting urgency. The alarm system is sophisticated. The calibration is, to put it gently, a work in progress. And here is what nobody tells you about that system. The thing that is quietly fascinating once you see it. The anxiety is not the problem. It is the solution your nervous system arrived at. An imperfect, outdated, frequently maddening solution. Yes, but a solution nonetheless. The mind generates anxiety because some part of it genuinely believes that worrying is protective. That if you just think about the problem hard enough and long enough, you will find the answer that makes you safe. There is something almost compassionate about understanding your own anxiety this way, not indulging it, not agreeing with it, but seeing it for what it is, an old, devoted, slightly confused guardian that is working very hard on your behalf with a map that was drawn for a completely different world. Jung spent a great deal of his life exploring what he called the shadow, the parts of the psyche that operate beneath conscious awareness, shaping behavior in ways the conscious mind doesn't fully understand. He noticed that the things we resist most strongly are often the things most worthy of understanding, that the psyche doesn't generate darkness randomly. It generates it in response to something it hasn't been allowed to process. And the anxious mind, the sleepless mind, is often a mind that has been refusing a conversation with itself for a very long time. Not because you are avoidant or weak, but because the modern world is extraordinarily good at providing distractions. There is always another thing to look at, another task to complete, another screen to stare into. And the self, the quiet, patient, slightly unkempt self underneath all of that, gets put on hold indefinitely, until the night comes and the distractions run out and the self, with a kind of resigned persistence, finally gets a word in. That is part of what is happening when you cannot sleep. It is not just stress. It is not just overstimulation, though those things are real. It is also the mind finally getting the quiet it needs to surface what has been waiting. The thoughts that feel intrusive at 3 in the morning are not random. They are cued. They have been waiting their turn all day. People rarely notice this. But the anxiety that visits you at night is often carrying something important. Not the literal content. The specific worry about money or relationships or the future is rarely the real message. The real message is underneath the worry. It is the feeling the worry is pointing to. Fear of being inadequate, fear of being abandoned, fear of a life that ends before it ever felt fully lived, fear of not mattering. These are the things that don't fit into a Tuesday afternoon, but find their way to the surface at midnight without asking permission. Here is the strange comfort in all of this. The mind that generates anxiety is also the mind capable of extraordinary insight. The same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to worry is the sensitivity that makes you capable of depth, of genuine connection, of the kind of awareness that makes life feel meaningful rather than merely managed. The anxious mind and the philosophical mind are very often the same mind, looking at the same darkness from different angles. One angle produces suffering, the other produces wisdom, and the distance between the two is not as far as it feels at 3 a.m. What begins to bridge that distance is something the ancient traditions understood with great precision, something that sounds simple until you try it, and turns out to be one of the most quietly radical acts available to a human being. But that bridge has a strange shape, and the first step onto it is nothing like what you'd expect. There is a moment in the meditations of Marcus Aurelius that stops most people when they first encounter it, not because it is dramatic, because it isn't, because it is written in the voice of a man talking to himself in the dark, privately, without performance, without the expectation that anyone would ever read it. And it sounds almost exactly like the voice inside your head on a difficult night. Marcus Aurelius was, by any measurable standard, one of the most powerful human beings who ever lived. He commanded the largest empire on earth. He presided over plagues, wars, betrayals, the deaths of children, the slow erosion of everything he tried to build. And he sat, night after night, and wrote to himself. Not proclamations, not philosophy for public consumption, just a man, in the quiet, trying to talk himself into something that resembled peace. What he returned to, again and again, was a practice so simple it almost sounds dismissive when you first hear it. He kept asking himself a single question. Is this within my control, or is it not? That's it. That is the skeleton of Stoic philosophy, stripped of its academic robes and standing plainly in the dark. Not a complex system, not a set of rules, just a question, a filter, a way of sorting the infinite chaos of experience into 2 piles, the things you can influence and the things you cannot, and then, with great gentleness and great firmness, releasing your grip on the second pile entirely. Now here is where it gets interesting, because most people hear this and think they understand it, and most people are half right. They apply it to the obvious things. I can't control the weather, they think. I can't control other people's opinions. I can't control the economy. True, correct, and also, somehow, not quite enough, because the anxiety continues anyway. And the reason it continues is that the Stoics were pointing at something much more interior than most people realize. They were not just talking about external events. They were talking about your relationship with your own mind. Because here is the thing your anxiety does not want you to know. Most of what you worry about is not happening to you. It is happening inside you. The worst case scenario playing on repeat is not reality. It is a production, a very convincing, very distressing, internally generated production that your mind is both the writer and the captive audience of simultaneously. Marcus Aurelius knew this. He wrote about it with the tone of a man who had caught his own mind in the act many times and had developed, not contempt for it, but a kind of fond exasperation. He understood that the mind will always generate material, that thoughts will always arrive uninvited, that feelings will always have opinions about your circumstances that are not necessarily accurate or useful, and he understood that none of that needed to be fought. It just needed to be seen clearly. Seeing clearly is different from thinking harder. This is a distinction that changes everything once it lands properly. Thinking harder about anxiety is like trying to put out a fire by adding more fuel and then thinking very intensely about water. The more mental energy you pour into the worry, the more the worry grows, because the mind interprets your attention as confirmation that the thing you're attending to is genuinely important and threatening. Anxiety feeds on engagement. It is, in this way, a deeply poor conversationalist the more you argue with it. The longer it stays at the table. Seeing clearly is something else. It is the quiet act of watching your own mind without immediately becoming whatever it's producing. The Stoics called this the observer faculty, the part of you that can notice a thought without being that thought, the part of you that can feel fear without being consumed by it, the part that can watch the anxious story unfold and say, gently, with neither judgment nor drama, there it is again. There is a line in Marcus Aurelius that reads, in essence, that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. It is one of the most quoted lines in Stoic philosophy, and it appears on enough inspirational merchandise to have lost some of its edge. But strip away the formatting and read it slowly in the dark. As a man talking to himself after a long day of governing an empire he never asked for, and it becomes something different. It becomes practical, urgent, true. The strength he's describing is not the strength of gritted teeth and clenched jaw. It is the strength of the person who has stopped fighting what cannot be changed and has turned, finally, fully, toward what can. And what can be changed, always, in every moment, regardless of circumstance, is the quality of attention you bring to your own experience. People rarely notice this, but the Stoic philosophy was never meant to make you feel less. It was never meant to produce a kind of emotional numbness dressed up as wisdom. Quite the opposite. It was meant to protect the interior world, the world of genuine feeling, of clear perception, of honest relationship with yourself, from the constant turbulence of the exterior one. It was a philosophy of radical interiority, a methodology for keeping the inner room clean and quiet, even when the hallway outside is chaotic. And in a world of constant noise, constant demand, constant performance, that inner room is not a luxury. It is the only place where actual rest becomes possible. The door to that room is not locked. It never was. You just may have forgotten, somewhere in the business of surviving modern life, that you are allowed to go inside. Tonight is a reasonable time to remember. Here is something that will feel uncomfortable for exactly one moment, and then quietly liberating for much longer. The thing you have been doing to feel better, the analyzing, the planning, the mental rehearsing, the careful construction of worst-case scenarios so you can feel prepared for them, is not helping you. Not in the way you hope it is. And the reason it is not helping you is both simple and deeply strange. The act of trying to escape anxiety is, in a very precise and measurable way, one of the primary things that keeps anxiety alive. This is the paradox at the center of the restless mind, and it is worth sitting with slowly, because the mind will resist it. The mind will say, no, that can't be right, I need to figure this out. If I just think about it enough, I'll find the answer that makes it stop. And that resistance, that very insistence on solving the anxiety, is the anxiety continuing by another name. Let's follow this carefully, because it is not an abstract idea. It is happening in real time, in real minds, every single night. When anxiety arrives, the almost universal human response is to treat it as a problem that requires immediate solving. Something is wrong. I feel wrong. I need to fix this feeling. And so the mind mobilizes. It searches for the source. It evaluates options. It runs simulations of possible futures. It rehearses conversations. It constructs arguments for and against various outcomes. It does all of this with genuine dedication and zero results. And then it does it again. Because the doing it again feels like progress, even when it demonstrably isn't. The Buddhists had a word for this pattern. They called it tanha, a kind of craving or grasping that extends not just to pleasure, but to outcomes, to certainty, to the desperate wish for things to be other than they are. And they observed, with remarkable precision, that the grasping itself is the suffering, not the original discomfort. The relationship with the discomfort, the refusal to allow the feeling to simply be what it is without immediately trying to make it into something else. This is not a passive philosophy. It is not telling you to lie down and give up. It is pointing at something much more subtle and much more radical. It is suggesting that the experience you are trying to escape might actually soften, not through effort, but through the removal of effort. That the anxiety, met with genuine stillness instead of frantic problems, has a natural lifespan that your interference has been unknowingly extending. Think about the last time you were truly tired and tried to force yourself to sleep. The harder you tried, the more awake you became. The more you monitored your own wakefulness, the more alert you felt. The attempt created the very condition it was trying to overcome. Sleep, like peace, like genuine rest, is not something you do. It is something that happens when you stop doing the things that prevent it, which is not exactly the inspirational, quote, mug version of life. But it is true in a way that has enormous practical implications for tonight. There is a concept in Taoist philosophy called Wu Wei, which is most commonly translated as non-action or effortless action. It is frequently misunderstood as passivity, as a kind of spiritual laziness dressed up in ancient robes. But that is a misreading. Wu Wei is not the absence of action. It is the absence of forced, resistant, friction-generating action. It is the art of moving with the nature of things rather than against it, of responding to reality as it is rather than as you wish it would be, of allowing the river to flow rather than exhausting yourself trying to push it uphill with your bare hands. Applied to the anxious mind, Wu Wei is this. Instead of fighting the anxiety, you notice it. Instead of arguing with the intrusive thought, you observe it. Instead of demanding that your nervous system calm down right now because you have things to do tomorrow, you let the nervous system do what it needs to do. And you watch it with the quiet patience of someone who has finally understood that resistance is not the same as strength. People rarely notice this, but the moments of genuine calm most people experience, the ones that actually work, the ones that feel like real relief rather than forced relaxation, almost never come from effort. They come from surrender, from the gap that opens up when you stop fighting long enough for the natural quiet to surface. You've felt this, the unexpected peace that arrives after you stop trying to solve something. The sudden lightness that follows a decision made not from analysis, but from exhaustion with the analysis. The body exhaling in a way the mind never permitted. That is not accident. That is the natural state reasserting itself in the brief pause between your attempts to override it. The paradox, fully held, looks like this. You cannot think your way to peace. You cannot worry your way to safety. You cannot control your way to freedom. Every tradition that has seriously engaged with the problem of human suffering has arrived at some version of this recognition. The Stoics, the Buddhists, the Taoists. the existentialists. They disagree on a great many things. They are remarkably consistent on this one. The route to the interior room is not through the front door of effort. It is through the side window of release. And release is not something you achieve. It is something you allow. You already know how to do this. You have done it before, in sleep, in moments of genuine laughter, in the rare afternoon when time slowed and you forgot to be anxious, because the present moment was simply too complete to need anything else. That capacity is not lost. It is just waiting, with characteristic patience, for you to stop trying to manufacture it. What the ancient traditions discovered next goes even deeper. It involves something they all noticed about wisdom that most people today find genuinely surprising. There is a library that no longer exists. It stood in Alexandria, in Egypt, somewhere between the 3rd century before the Common Era and its eventual destruction across several painful centuries of fire and neglect and human indifference to beautiful things. At its peak, it is estimated to have held somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls, the precise number lost, fittingly, to history. Mathematics, medicine, poetry, astronomy, philosophy. The collected thinking of dozens of civilizations gathered in one place, under one roof. In a city built at the edge of the known world. Most of it is gone now. And yet, the ideas that survived, the ones that were copied and carried, and whispered across centuries and translated into languages that didn't exist when they were first written, those ideas share something remarkable, something that is easy to overlook precisely because it shows up everywhere, in every tradition, in every language. In every corner of the ancient world, they all pointed toward the same thing, the same quiet, inconvenient, endlessly patient truth, that the peace you are looking for is not somewhere ahead of you. It is not waiting at the end of a self-improvement plan or a productivity system or a particularly successful week. It was never outside you in the first place. Every great wisdom tradition, from the Stoics in Greece to the Buddhists, in India to the Taoists, in China to the thinkers in Rome to the Sufi mystics in Persia, arrived at some version of this recognition independently, across vast distances of geography and time. The ancients knew something we forgot, and what they knew was not complicated. It was just deeply, stubbornly countercultural in every era, including this one. They knew that the mind turned outward, grasping at outcomes, measuring itself against others, chasing certainty in an uncertain world would always suffer. Not sometimes, always, without exception. Not because the world is cruel, but because that orientation, that constant outward reaching, is simply incompatible with rest. You cannot be simultaneously grasping and at peace. The hand cannot be clenched and open at the same time. And they knew that the mind turned inward, not in the navel-gazing, self-obsessed sense, but in the sense of genuine self-knowledge, of clear-eyed awareness of one's own nature, had access to something that the outward-facing mind could never find, no matter how far it traveled or how much it accumulated, a kind of stillness that was not dependent on circumstances, a kind of okayness that did not require the world to cooperate. Seneca, writing letters to his friend Lucilius from a Rome that was, by most accounts, a deeply anxious and politically unstable place, said something that lands differently when you read it slowly at night. He said, in essence, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, that the mind, left unsupervised, will generate suffering far in excess of what the actual circumstances require. and that the remedy is not to eliminate difficulty from your life, which is impossible, but to cultivate an interior that does not collapse under the weight of difficulty. That word, cultivate, is important, because the ancients were not describing a state you either have or don't have. They were describing a practice, a daily, unglamorous, sometimes tedious practice of returning attention to what is real, to what is present, to what is actually within the scope of a human life, and gently releasing everything else. The Buddhist practice of meditation is at its most stripped down, exactly this: not emptying the mind, not achieving some elevated spiritual state that requires years of mountain retreat. Just sitting, just noticing, just watching the thoughts arise and pass without grabbing onto them and making them into a story about who you are and what your life means. The thoughts will still come. The worries will still appear. The difference is in the relationship. The difference is between being swept away by the river and sitting on the bank watching it flow. People rarely notice this, but the reason these ancient practices still work, still genuinely work, in bodies wearing modern clothes, in minds shaped by smartphones and 24-hour news cycles, is that they were never addressing the content of the anxiety. They were addressing the structure of it, the mechanism, the way the mind relates to its own experience, and that mechanism has not changed in 2,000 years. Regardless of what the specific worry happens to be, the Taoists spoke of returning, not advancing, not achieving, not optimizing, returning. Returning to what was always already there beneath the noise. They described the natural state of the human mind, undisturbed, as something like water, clear when still, reflecting everything accurately, moving without resistance around obstacles. Not because water is passive, but because water is intelligent in a way that force never is. Your mind, at its natural bottom, is like that water, clear, quiet, capable of profound reflection. The anxiety is not your mind. It is the disturbance on the surface, and the ancient traditions were unanimous on this point. You do not remove the disturbance by thrashing around in it. You remove it by becoming still enough that it settles on its own. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in one of his quieter moments, that if you were distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your own estimate of it. And this power you have, he said, to revoke at any moment, not after years of practice, not after achieving enlightenment, not after your circumstances improve or your relationships stabilize or the uncertainty of your life resolves itself into something manageable. Now, in this moment, in this breath, the power to revoke the estimate, to look at the thing that is frightening you and ask, with genuine curiosity, is this as dangerous as I am making it? Is this as permanent as it feels? Is this as certain as the anxiety insists it is? Almost always, the answer is no. And that no, quiet as it is the beginning of everything. There is something sitting directly in front of you right now that you have been consistently, almost impressively, overlooking. Not because you are unobservant, not because you lack the intelligence to see it, but because the mind in a state of anxiety has a very particular blind spot, and that blind spot is, with a kind of cosmic irony, located precisely where the relief is. Here is what it is. And it is so simple that the first instinct is to dismiss it as insufficient. The present moment is not anxious. You are anxious about things that exist in the past or the future. The present moment itself, this breath, this room, this particular configuration of darkness and quiet, contains, right now, almost nothing that requires your alarm. That sounds obvious, and in a way it is. But there is a difference between hearing it and actually dropping into it, even for a single breath. Because the mind, trained by years of future orientation and past rehearsal, treats the present moment like a waiting room, a place to sit impatiently while you think about where you actually need to be. The present moment becomes merely the location from which you worry about everything else, rather than the thing itself, rather than the only place where life is actually, unambiguously, occurring. The ancients noticed this with extraordinary clarity. The Stoics built their entire practice around the concept they called the present moment as home. The idea that the only time a human being ever truly inhabits is now, and that all suffering is, in some fundamental sense, a refusal to be where you actually are. Epictetus, despite having no freedom in any external sense, described a quality of interior freedom that came from exactly this. From the radical act of being genuinely fully present in the only moment that could not be taken from him. And here is the thing that people almost never notice, the thing hiding in plain sight. Anxiety cannot survive sustained contact with the present moment. Not because the present moment is always pleasant, sometimes it isn't, but because anxiety, as a psychological state, requires time. It requires the ability to project forward into a future that hasn't happened, or to look backward at a past that cannot be changed. Bring the attention back to right now, not in a forced way, not with gritted teeth, mindfulness, but genuinely, softly, curiously, and the anxiety has no ground to stand on. It needs time the way a fire needs oxygen. Remove the oxygen and the fire doesn't fight you. It simply goes out. You have probably experienced this without naming it. The moment a piece of genuinely absorbing music made you forget what you were worried about. The moment a conversation became so real and so present that the background noise of anxiety went quiet without you asking it to. The moment in nature, a particular quality of light, a sound that arrived at exactly the right frequency, that emptied your mind without effort. These are not accidents or distractions. These are demonstrations, brief, unscheduled demonstrations of what the mind is capable, of when it is genuinely here rather than somewhere else. The paradox, and there is always a paradox at the center of these things, is that we spend enormous energy trying to get somewhere better, when the place we are trying to get to is actually the place we already are. We are reaching forward for a peace that exists only in the present, which means every act of reaching forward moves us further from it. The destination is behind the effort, not ahead of it. People rarely notice this, but the most anxious moments of most people's lives are not happening during genuinely difficult circumstances. They are happening during ordinary ones. Lying in bed on a Tuesday, sitting in traffic on a Wednesday, standing in the shower on a Thursday morning, running a catastrophe simulation about a conversation that may never happen. The circumstances are neutral. The mind is not. And the mind is not neutral because it has been given no instruction in how to be where it is. No practice in inhabiting the ordinary moment without immediately needing it to be more, or different, or resolved. The ancient prescription for this is not complicated, but it is countercultural in a way that the modern world resists almost instinctively. It is simply this: practice returning, not achieving, not arriving, just returning. Every time the mind drifts into the future or the past, and it will, constantly, because that is what minds do, gently, without drama, without self-criticism, return it to now, to this breath, to the weight of your body where it rests, to the temperature of the air, to the small, physical, undeniable reality of being here. This is not emptying your mind. Your mind will not empty. It is not meant to. It is training your attention the way you would train a very enthusiastic but poorly focused dog to come back when called, gently, without punishment, with the patient understanding that the wandering is not failure, it is just the nature of the animal. The returning is the practice. The wandering is not the enemy. It is just the opportunity to return again. Marcus Aurelius returned to this practice hundreds of times across the pages of his private journal. Each entry is, in some sense, another returning, another gentle redirection of a mind that had drifted into anxiety, into judgment, into the noise of empire. He never claimed to have solved it. He just kept returning, which is, quietly, one of the most honest and human things any philosopher has ever written. The thing you keep overlooking is this: you have never actually spent a moment in the future. You have never once visited the catastrophe your mind rehearses so faithfully. Every moment of your entire life has taken place right here, in the present, in the only moment that has ever actually existed. And in this present moment, right now, tonight, there is more quiet available to you than the anxious mind will ever voluntarily admit. The next layer of this is deeper still, and it involves something that lives even closer to the center of the self than attention does. Somewhere along the way, you developed a version of yourself that needed to be managed. Not the real you, not the one that exists before the performance begins in the morning, before the first social interaction of the day, before you've had a chance to calibrate yourself to whatever version of yourself the situation seems to require. The other one, the constructed one, the carefully maintained identity that has opinions about how your life should look, how you should be perceived, how far along you should be by now, and what it means about you that you are not further along than you are. This version of you is exhausting to maintain, and it is, though it will resist this characterization vigorously, a primary engine of your anxiety. Here is what most people do not stop to examine. The anxiety that visits you at night is rarely about the surface-level content it claims to be about. It presents itself as being about money, or a relationship, or a professional situation, or the unread messages on your phone. But underneath the presenting issue, almost always, is something more intimate. A question about identity, about worth, about whether you are, at some fundamental level, enough, capable enough, lovable enough, together enough to deserve the life you want and to be safe in the life you have. This is the self on trial, and it runs a very long court session. The psychological insight here is one that Jung circled throughout his career, and that the Stoics approached from a different angle, and that the Buddhist tradition addressed most directly of all. The self that suffers most is not the real self. It is the ego, the constructed identity, the story you tell about who you are, and the ego is, by its very nature, fragile, because it is built from the outside in, built from comparison and approval and the carefully assembled evidence that you are acceptable, worthy, adequate, and anything built from the outside in can be threatened from the outside in, which means the ego must remain permanently vigilant, permanently defensive, permanently anxious. The ego is, in this sense, anxiety's home address. Now, this is not a dismissal of the self. It is not telling you that you don't matter or that your identity is an illusion and you should simply dissolve into the universe and feel better. That particular brand of advice, while sometimes well-intentioned, is not especially useful at midnight. What it is saying is something more precise and more actionable. The part of you that is suffering most right now is the part of you that is most identified with a story. And stories, unlike genuine experience, can be questioned, can be loosened, can be held a little less tightly without the whole thing falling apart. Epictetus made a distinction that has survived 2,000 years because it continues to be true. He separated what he called the things that are ours from the things that are not ours. The things that are ours are our judgments, our values, our responses, our quality of attention. The things that are not ours include our reputation, other people's opinions, outcomes we cannot control, the way the world decides to arrange itself despite our preferences. The ego, almost by definition, has built its entire sense of security on the things that are not ours, on the approval that might be withdrawn, on the success that might not arrive, on the identity that depends on external validation to remain intact. And this is not a moral failure. It is a developmental one. It is what happens when a conscious creature grows up in a world that consistently ties worth to performance, love to achievement, safety to status. You absorbed the message. Everyone does. The question is not whether you absorbed it, but whether you are willing, now, in the quiet of tonight, to begin examining it. People rarely notice this, but most of the self-criticism that circles in the anxious mind at night is not original thought. It is internalized voice. It is the accumulated opinion of every teacher, every parent, every peer, every cultural message that ever suggested your value was conditional. You didn't generate that voice from scratch. You inherited it, and you have been faithfully running it on a loop, often without realizing that you are the one choosing to press play. The existentialists had a great deal to say about this. Sartre's notion that existence precedes essence, that you are not born with a fixed identity but that you construct, one through choices and actions, is in some ways terrifying and in other ways profoundly liberating. Terrifying because it removes the comfort of predetermined purpose. Liberating because it means the story is not finished. The verdict is not in. The version of yourself that feels inadequate or behind or anxious is not the final word. It is a draft, a very human, very understandable draft written under difficult conditions. Who was himself no stranger to anxiety. He wrote an entire book about it, called The Concept of Anxiety, which sounds either like a very brave or a very masochistic project depending on your perspective. Observed that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, that the very openness of human existence, the fact that you are not predetermined, that you must choose and become, generates a particular kind of vertigo. Not because freedom is bad, but because it is vast. And vastness, for a creature that craves certainty, feels a great deal like falling. But here is what the falling actually is, when you look at it clearly. It is not danger. It is possibility. The open future that the ego finds terrifying is the same open future that contains every good thing that has ever arrived unexpectedly in your life. Every connection you didn't plan for. Every moment of grace you couldn't have engineered. Every version of yourself you became without knowing in advance that you were becoming it. The self on trial tonight does not need a verdict. It needs a recess. A long, quiet, gentle recess where nobody is being evaluated and nothing needs to be proven, and the only thing required is exactly what is already here, which is simply this: you breathing in the dark. still here. There is a kind of suffering that nobody volunteers for, and yet almost everyone, at some point in their life, finds themselves sitting inside it with no clear memory of how they arrived. It is not the sharp suffering of acute loss. That kind has a clarity to it, a defined shape, a before and after that the mind can at least orient itself around. This other kind is softer and stranger. It is the suffering of feeling vaguely wrong about your own life, of carrying a persistent sense that something is missing or misaligned, or quietly off in a way you cannot locate precisely enough to fix, of waking up in the middle of the night with a feeling that resembles grief but has no obvious object, that the wisdom traditions did not promise to remove this suffering. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that separates genuine ancient wisdom from the kind of motivational content that promises transformation in 30 days or your money back. They did not say the suffering would end. They said something far more unsettling. They said the suffering had a function, that it was not a malfunction of human experience, but an essential feature of it, that it was, in fact, the very thing most likely to lead you somewhere real, if you were willing to stop treating it purely as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a message to be understood. This is a hard sell, especially at night, when the suffering is present and the philosophical reframe feels abstract and the body just wants it to stop, but stay with it for a moment. The Buddhist concept of dukkha is often translated as suffering, but the original meaning is more nuanced than that. It is closer to unsatisfaction, a kind of inherent incompleteness in conditioned experience. The recognition that everything that arises is impermanent. Everything that is pleasant will eventually become unpleasant or simply absent, and the self that is grasping for permanence in an impermanent world will always, inevitably, experience a gap between what it wants and what is, not as punishment, not as cosmic injustice, just as the natural consequence of being a finite creature in an infinite and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful universe. What the Buddhists pointed at was not the elimination of this gap, but the transformation of your relationship with it. The invitation was not to stop wanting or stop feeling. It was to stop demanding that the gap be closed, to stop treating the incompleteness as evidence that something has gone wrong with you specifically, rather than as the texture of conscious existence in general. Approaching the same territory from a completely different direction, wrote about what he called amor fati, the love of fate, not the resigned acceptance of fate, not the gritted teeth tolerance of what cannot be changed, the love of it, the full-bodied embrace of your life as it actually is, including the suffering, including the uncertainty, including the parts that did not go the way you'd planned, and the wounds that did not heal cleanly, and the dreams that arrived late or not at all. He was not romanticizing pain. He was pointing at something that takes real courage to consider, that a life fully accepted, suffering included, is more whole than a life spent in constant negotiation with reality about what should and shouldn't be allowed to exist. People rarely notice this, but there is an enormous amount of suffering generated not by the difficult things that have happened, but by the argument with the fact that they happened. The grief is real, the wound is real, but layered on top of the grief is often a secondary suffering made entirely of resistance, of the relentless internal insistence that this should not have happened, that it should be different, that the universe made an error it needs to correct, and the universe, with characteristic indifference to our preferences, declines to correct it, and the resistance continues, and the suffering doubles. Acceptance, genuine acceptance, not the performance of it, does not mean approval. It does not mean the difficult thing was fine, or deserved, or without consequence. It means simply this: it happened. It is part of the fabric of your life now, and fighting the fabric does not remove the thread. It just exhausts the person doing the fighting. Seneca wrote that the wise person neither seeks suffering nor avoids it, but meets it with the equanimity of someone who understands that it is neither the enemy it appears to be, nor the defeat it feels like. He described adversity as the raw material of character, not because suffering is good, but because the response to suffering is where the deepest human qualities are forged. Courage is not forged in the absence of fear. Patience is not developed in the absence of frustration. Peace is not found in the absence of difficulty. It is found, as every tradition that is seriously engaged with the question agrees, in a relationship with difficulty that has stopped requiring it to be otherwise. This does not resolve in a single night. It is not supposed to. The suffering you are carrying tonight may be old, and some of it may be yours to carry for a long time yet. That is honest, and honesty, however uncomfortable, is always more useful than false comfort. But here, in the quiet, there is something available that requires no resolution at all. There is the simple, strange, underrated peace of not fighting for one night, of letting the suffering be what it is without adding the second arrow, of allowing the feeling to exist without requiring it to make sense or to leave on your schedule. The feeling is not you. It is something moving through you. Like weather moves through a landscape without being the landscape. The trees bend. The rain falls. The landscape remains. You are the landscape. And somewhere beneath the weather of tonight, that ground is steadier than the anxiety remembers to tell you. There is a particular kind of courage that never gets celebrated. Not the courage of action, the dramatic, visible, story-worthy kind that gets written about and admired and placed on the kind of motivational posters that nobody actually reads after the first week. That courage has its place. But there is another kind, quieter and in many ways harder, that the wisdom traditions recognized and valued, and that the modern world is almost entirely forgotten to honor. It is the courage of surrender, not surrender as defeat, not the white flag of the broken person who has simply run out of fight. Something more deliberate than that, more conscious, the kind of surrender that requires you to look clearly at everything. You have been gripping every outcome you have been trying to force, every version of the future you have been trying to manufacture, every version of yourself you have been trying to protect and to open the hand. Not because you don't care, because you have understood, finally and fully, that the gripping was never protecting you. It was only exhausting you. Tonight, if nothing else, is an invitation to practice this. The Taoist tradition has a beautiful and underappreciated concept that maps this territory precisely. It is the image of water. Water, the Taoists observed, is the softest substance in the natural world. It yields to everything. It flows around every obstacle. It never insists. It never forces. It takes the shape of whatever contains it without complaint and without resistance. And yet water, over time, carves canyons through solid rock, not through force, through persistence, through the patient, yielding, utterly non-aggressive act of simply continuing to flow. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to the ancient philosopher Laozi, describes this as the power of the feminine principle, not feminine in a gendered sense, but in the sense of receptivity, of softness, of the intelligence that knows when to yield rather than push. and it suggests, in its characteristically oblique way, that the human being who learns to move like water, who learns to release rather than grip, to yield rather than force, to accept rather than resist, will find a kind of strength that the gripping, forcing, resisting person will never access. Because the gripping, forcing, resisting person is always tired, always braced, always spending enormous quantities of interior energy maintaining a defensive posture against a world that was never quite as threatening as the anxiety insisted it was. You know this tiredness. It is the specific exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from holding on too tightly. It sits differently in the body than ordinary fatigue. It is in the jaw, maybe, or the space between the shoulder blades, or the particular quality of wakefulness at 2 in the morning that feels less like energy and more like a system that does not know how to power down. That is the tiredness of a mind that has been gripping all day and does not have a clear instruction for how to let go. The instruction, from every tradition that is seriously engaged with it, is not complicated, but it requires something the modern mind finds genuinely difficult. It requires trust, not blind trust. Not the kind that pretends that difficult things are not difficult, or that the uncertainty is not real, or that the things you fear could not actually happen, but a deeper, quieter trust. A trust in the basic resilience of your own nature. A trust that the self underneath the anxiety, the one that existed before the worry had a name, the one that has survived every difficult night so far without exception, is more durable than the anxiety gives it credit for. Marcus Aurelius returned to this again and again in his private writing. He reminded himself, in the way that a person reminds themselves of something they know but keep forgetting, that he had survived everything the world had thrown at him so far, that the same nature that produced the difficulty also produced the capacity to meet it, that the universe was not arranged against him, even when it felt that way, and that the appropriate response to this recognition was not gratitude performed for an audience, but something quieter, something that looked, from the outside, almost like doing nothing. People rarely notice this, but the letting go is not a single event. It is not a dramatic moment of release after which everything is different. It is a practice. A repeated, unglamorous, sometimes tedious practice of noticing when you have picked the grip back up, because you will, because the hand is trained for it, because the nervous system defaults to holding, and gently, without self-criticism, opening the hand again, and again, and again. This is what the Stoics meant by discipline. Not the white-knuckled, self-denying discipline of someone grinding through misery for a future reward. The discipline of returning, of coming back to the open hand, of choosing, in each small moment, the response of water rather than the response of stone. There is something profoundly restful about this. Once it begins to settle, because it removes a burden you may not have fully realized you were carrying. The burden of needing to have everything figured out before you are allowed to be okay. The burden of needing the anxiety to be resolved before you can rest. The burden of needing life to arrange itself according to your preferences before you grant yourself permission to exhale. You do not need any of that to be true tonight. The exhale is available right now, independent of outcomes, independent of circumstances, independent of whether tomorrow goes the way you hope or the way you fear or some third option you haven't yet imagined. The night is asking nothing of you. The dark outside your window has no agenda. The quiet in this room is not waiting for you to earn it. It is simply here, as it has always been, patient, unhurried, and entirely willing to hold you for as long as you need. Let it. There is a thought experiment that the Stoics used, and it has a slightly dramatic name that belies how quietly useful it actually is. Asterisk. They called it the view from above. Asterisk. The practice is simple. You imagine lifting your perspective gently, without force. The way a thermal lifts a bird without the bird doing any particular work, until you are looking at your life from a very great height. Not from a place of detachment or cold indifference, from a place of genuine perspective. From the kind of altitude where the thing that was consuming your entire interior world a moment ago becomes visible in its actual proportion relative to everything else that exists. Asterisk. Marcus Aurelius used this practice regularly. He would remind himself in his private writing of the vast scale of time and space within which his particular worries were occurring. He thought about the generations of people who had lived and died before him, each carrying their own urgent anxieties, each convinced that their particular troubles were uniquely significant, each eventually absorbed back into the same silence that waits for all of us, not in a morbid way, in a clarifying way, in the way that a long exhale clarifies the lungs. Asterisk. He wrote about the brevity of all things, about how quickly the celebrated and the forgotten alike dissolve into the same historical silence, about how the emperor and the beggar occupy the same cosmic footnote when measured against the scale of deep time. And he found in this reflection not despair, but something closer to lightness. A loosening of the grip that anxiety had placed on his sense of what mattered and what didn't. Asterisk. This is the perspective shift, and it is available to you right now, lying where you are, in whatever room you inhabit tonight. Asterisk. Think about the thing that was troubling you most today. Hold it in your mind for just a moment, not to analyze it, not to solve it, but just to see it clearly. Now lift the lens. Pull back from it the way a camera pulls back to reveal the wider frame. There you are, in your room, in your city, on a particular night, in a particular year, carrying that particular worry. Now pull back further. Your city in its country, your country on its continent, the continent on its planet, the planet in its solar system, the solar system in its galaxy, the galaxy in a universe so vast that the number of stars within it exceeds the number of grains of sand on every beach on Earth by a factor that the human mind cannot genuinely comprehend. Asterisk. Your worry is still real. This is not an argument that it isn't, but its proportion has shifted slightly, and sometimes slightly is enough. Asterisk. The existentialists approached this same territory from a different angle and arrived at a similar place, though they took a more dramatic route to get there. Camus, staring directly into the apparent meaninglessness of existence, into the absurd, as he called it, the fundamental mismatch between the human desire for meaning and the universe's complete indifference to that. Desire did not conclude that this was a tragedy. He concluded, in what remains one of philosophy's most quietly revolutionary moves, that it was a liberation. Asterisk. If the universe has no predetermined meaning to impose on your life, then the meaning of your life is not something you discover. It is something you create. And the anxiety that comes from trying to locate the right answer, the correct path, the objectively justified choice, that anxiety is based on a premise that was never true. There is no hidden cosmic rubric against which your choices are being evaluated. There is just you, and the life you are living, and the quality of attention you bring to it. Asterisk. Which is not exactly the anxiety-reducing message your ego was hoping for. but stay with it because it becomes something else on the other side. Asterisk people rarely notice this, but the removal of the cosmic pressure to get it right is, once the initial vertigo passes, one of the most restful realizations available to a human mind. You are not being gridded. The universe is not keeping score. The terrible thing you are afraid of doing, or being, or failing at is being evaluated by exactly no external cosmic authority whatsoever. The only chord that matters is the interior one, and the interior one, as we have already seen, is a chord you have far more influence over than you have been exercising. Asterisk Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. He was not being harsh, he was being specific. The waste he was describing was not laziness or moral failure, it was the waste of presence. The hours spent in imagined futures and rehearsed pasts. The days spent braced against possible suffering rather than inhabited with the actual experience of being alive. The life spent preparing to live rather than living. Asterisk tonight. From this small altitude, that waste becomes visible without judgment. Just visible. Just the quiet recognition that a lot of what has been consuming your interior, life has been occurring in a time and place that does not exist. That the present moment, this breath, this weight, this particular quality of darkness has been patiently available this entire time, waiting for your return. Asterisk, from the view from above, the things that seem to require your constant vigilance look different, smaller in some ways, but also more manageable, more human, more like the ordinary challenges of an ordinary conscious life rather than the existential emergencies the anxiety promoted them to. Asterisk, you are a small, warm, briefly luminous thing in an incomprehensibly large universe, doing your best with a mind that was never designed for the world you are actually living in. Asterisk, that is not a criticism. It is, in the most genuine sense available tonight, something close to tender. Asterisk nth from this height, something else becomes visible too. Something quieter and more surprising than the vastness of space. Asterisk the truth that lives not in the grand view, but in the very small one. Come back down now. Not all the way back to the noise, just down from the altitude of the last thought, back to something closer, something at eye level, something that lives not in the scale of galaxies but in the scale of a single human breath, a single quiet room, a single night that is asking nothing more of you than to be here inside it. Because there is a truth that only reveals itself at this scale, a truth that the grand philosophical view can gesture toward, but cannot quite deliver. It requires closeness. It requires the willingness to look not outward at the vast universe, or inward at the complicated architecture of the self, but at something even simpler than both of those, at the raw, unmediated, pre-analytical experience of this moment. Here's the quiet truth beneath the noise. Underneath every anxious thought, without exception, is not a problem waiting to be solved. It is a feeling waiting to be heard. This is not a small distinction. It is, in fact, the distinction that changes everything. The mind that is trained by anxiety treats feelings as alarms, as signals of danger that require immediate response, as problems with emotional clothing on, and so every feeling that arrives, the low-grade dread, the nameless sadness, the formless worry, gets immediately converted into a cognitive project. What is causing this? How do I fix it? What does it mean about me? What should I do? And the feeling, which was never asking for any of those things, gets buried under the cognitive response to it, and it never gets to finish what it was trying to say. The Jungian tradition was deeply interested in this. Jung believed that the psyche communicates through feeling, through image, through symbol, through the language of the interior, rather than the language of the analytical mind. And that a mind which consistently overrides feeling with analysis is a mind that is effectively refusing to listen to itself, which generates, over time, a kind of internal pressure, a building sense of unheard things, which expresses itself, eventually, as the very anxiety the mind was trying to outthink. You cannot think your way to understanding your feelings. You can only feel your way there. And feeling your way there does not mean being overwhelmed by the feeling. It does not mean opening a floodgate and disappearing into the emotion. It means something much gentler and much more precise. It means turning toward the feeling with genuine curiosity instead of immediate resistance. It means asking not what caused this or how to fix it, but simply, what is this? What does this feel like, exactly? Where does it live in the body? What quality does it have? What does it actually need? This is extraordinarily difficult for the anxious mind, because the anxious mind has been trained to treat feelings as threats, to approach them the way a person approaches a stray dog, with caution, with the exit route already located, with the overriding goal of not getting bitten. But the feeling is not a stray dog. It is more like a child who has been trying to get your attention for a very long time and has started pulling harder and harder because the gentle approach wasn't working. When you turn toward it, the pulling often stops. Not always immediately, not always completely, but there is, almost always, a softening, a reduction in the pressure, a sense of the interior space becoming slightly less congested, because the feeling has been acknowledged, because something that was screaming into a closed room has been heard. People rarely notice this, but the anxiety that feels most unbearable is usually not the anxiety itself. It is the anxiety about the anxiety, the fear of the feeling, the dread of the dread, the meta layer of suffering that the mind generates when it decides that feeling anxious is itself a problem requiring emergency intervention. Remove the meta layer, not by force, but by genuine willingness to sit with the underlying feeling, and what remains is often much more manageable than the whole layered construction suggested. The Stoics practiced something they called prosoche, a quality of attention to the present moment and to the interior life that was neither harsh nor indulgent. Not the grim self-scrutiny of someone trying to catch themselves doing something wrong. More like the attention of a skilled gardener who walked through the garden not to criticize it, but to see it clearly. To notice what is thriving and what needs water and what has been crowded out by something that grew faster than expected. With patience, with genuine interest, with the fundamental assumption that what is there is worth understanding. This is the quality of attention that makes the quiet truth accessible. Not the interrogating attention of the anxious mind, but the patient, curious, fundamentally kind attention of someone who has decided, at least for tonight, to stop treating themselves like a problem and start treating themselves like a person. A person who is tired, who has been carrying a great deal, who has been trying, with genuine dedication and considerable skill, to manage an interior life that was never meant to be managed alone, in the dark, with no help and no rest. That person deserves to be heard, not fixed, not improved, not made more productive or more resilient or more positive. Just heard, just acknowledged, just allowed to be exactly as they are in this moment, without the requirement that they be further along or more sorted or less afraid. There is a line that arrives sometimes in the space between waking and sleeping, in the gap where the analytical mind briefly loses its grip and something older and quieter surfaces. It does not come in words exactly. It comes as a feeling, a recognition, something that says, in the language beneath language, that you are okay, that you have always been okay, that the self underneath the anxiety is not as damaged or as lost or as far behind as the anxiety has been insisting all this time. That feeling is not wishful thinking. It is the quiet truth, and it has been here, patient and undemanding, beneath the noise, this entire time. There is an ancient practice so simple that the modern mind almost always dismisses it before giving it a fair hearing. It has no app. It generates no data. It produces nothing measurable, nothing shareable, nothing that can be optimized or tracked or turned into a morning routine that gets posted online. It requires no equipment, no training, no subscription, and no particular belief system. It has been practiced in some form by every wisdom tradition that has ever seriously engaged with the question of human peace, from the forest monks of ancient India to the desert fathers of early Christianity, to the Zen masters of medieval Japan, to the Stoic philosophers of Rome. It is simply this: sitting quietly and doing nothing. Not nothing in the sense of vacancy, not the glazed, scrolling, passively stimulated nothing of a screen in a dark room. Genuine nothing. The deliberate, chosen, fully conscious act of being present, without agenda, without output, without the requirement that the time produce anything other than the experience of having been quietly, unhurriedly, completely here. The Japanese have a concept called ma. It is usually translated as negative space, or pause, or interval, but none of these translations quite capture it. Ma is the pregnant quality of emptiness, the meaningful silence between notes that makes music possible, the space in a room that gives the objects within it room to breathe, the pause in a conversation that allows what was just said to actually land. It is not absence, it is presence of a different kind, the presence of spaciousness itself, which is only perceivable when the filling up has stopped. Your mind needs ma, desperately, chronically, in a way that the modern world, with its horror of unscheduled silence, has made almost structurally impossible to access. Think about the texture of an ordinary day. From the moment the alarm sounds, the filling up begins. Sound, information, obligation, stimulus, response, decision, performance. Layer after layer of input and output, with the transitions between them filled immediately by the phone, by music, by podcast, by the internal monologue that picks up every time the external noise pauses for breath. The system never gets too empty. The cup never gets to drain. And so it carries forward, day after day, the accumulated residue of everything that went in and never fully processed. Which is, among other things, a fairly precise description of anxiety. The ancient practice of stillness, whether you call it meditation or contemplation or simply sitting, is not about achieving a particular mental state. This is the misunderstanding that stops most people before they begin. They try it. The mind immediately produces thoughts. They conclude they are doing it wrong, and they stop. But the thoughts are not the problem. The thoughts are the residue draining. The mind clearing itself, the way a pool clears when the stirring stops and the sediment is allowed to settle. You do not have to make this happen. You just have to stop preventing it. The Taoist tradition describes this with characteristic elegance. The Tao Te Ching says, in one of its most quietly radical passages, that to attain knowledge, add things every day. To attain wisdom, remove things every day. The entire orientation of modern life is addition. More information, more stimulation, more productivity, more optimization, more self-improvement. And all of that addition, whatever its individual merits, accumulates as noise, as a layer of acquired complexity between you and the simple, quiet, uncluttered experience of being alive. Wisdom, the Taoists suggested, moves in the opposite direction, not through accumulation, but through subtraction, not through achieving, but through releasing, not through becoming more, but through discovering what remains when you stop adding. What remains, when the noise settles, is something that has always been there. The awareness itself, the simple, prior to thought fact of being conscious, of being here, not as a self that needs managing, or an identity that needs defending, or a life that needs curating. Just as presence, just as the bare, undeniable, quietly miraculous fact of awareness meeting this moment. People rarely notice this, but the peace they are looking for is not a mental state to be achieved. It is the natural condition of awareness when awareness is not being asked to do 12 things simultaneously. It is what is left when the activity stops. Not emptiness, not blankness, something warm and spacious and faintly luminous that the contemplative traditions across every culture and every century have pointed at with varying words and unanimous recognition. The Buddhist term is Rigpa. The Taoist term is the uncarved block. The Christian mystics called it the ground of the soul. The Stoics described it as the rational faculty at rest. The words differ. The pointing is identical. There is something in you that is prior to the anxiety, prior to the story, prior to the constructed self and its exhausting maintenance schedule. Something that does not need the anxiety to resolve before it can be peaceful. Something that is, in a very specific sense, already peaceful beneath the weather of experience, the way the ocean floor is already still beneath a storm. Tonight, in this quiet, you are closer to that than you usually get. The distractions are fewer. The demands are temporarily suspended. The performance has been given the night off. You do not have to manufacture stillness. You just have to stop filling the space where it already lives. Let the breath slow. Let the thoughts pass without engagement, the way clouds pass a window you have stopped looking out of. Let the silence be what it is, not threatening, not empty, not a void that needs filling, but a presence, a companion, the oldest and most patient form of comfort that exists. The doing nothing that looks like nothing from the outside is, from the inside, the most intimate contact available between a human being and their own deepest nature. And that contact, maintained for even a few quiet minutes, does something to the nervous system that no amount of thinking has ever managed to replicate. The body knows this. The breath knows this. Some part of you, older than the anxiety, has always known this. Rest there, just for a moment, just here. You were always going to be okay. Not in the way the anxiety disputed, not in the way that required proof or evidence or a specific set of outcomes lining up in your favor. In a deeper way than that, in the way that was true before the anxiety arrived and will be true after it passes and has been true. Quietly and without announcement, through every difficult night you have ever lived. You are still here. That is not a small thing. Every hard night you thought might not end eventually did. Every version of the future you dreaded either never arrived or arrived and was survived. Every time the floor felt like it was disappearing beneath you, it held. Not always comfortably. Not always in the way you hoped, but it held. The wisdom traditions, all of them, across all their differences, converge on this in the end. Not on a doctrine or a system or a set of rules for living correctly. They converge on a recognition. A single, quiet, endlessly patient recognition that has been waiting at the end of every genuine philosophical journey ever undertaken. That underneath the anxiety, underneath the constructed self and its requirements, underneath the noise and the performance and the relentless forward motion of a life being lived, there is something that is not troubled. Something that has never been troubled. Not really, not at its center. Something that the Stoics call the rational soul, and the Buddhists called Buddha nature, and the Taoists called returning to the root, and the existentialists gesturally pointed at in the space between anguish and freedom. You don't have to name it. Names are, in the end, just more noise. What matters is this. That thing is you. The real you, underneath the version that worries. Underneath the version that compares itself and falls short and wakes at 3 in the morning running catastrophe simulations. Underneath all of that, there is something that is simply here, simply aware, simply present in the ongoing, unhurried, quietly astonishing fact of being alive on a particular night, on a particular planet, in a universe that did not have to produce consciousness, but somehow did. The ancient philosopher Zhuangzi, a Taoist thinker whose writing has a quality of dreamy, almost playful wisdom that still feels startlingly alive after 2,000 years, told a story about dreaming. He was a butterfly, fluttering freely, with no knowledge of being Zhuangzi, then wakened to find himself a man again. And he asked, with genuine philosophical curiosity, was he a man who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming of being a man? He was not trying to destabilize reality. He was pointing at something about the nature of the self that is very hard to hold in the daytime and becomes, somehow, more accessible in the dark. The boundaries are softer here. The certainties are gentler. The self that has been managing everything all day loosens, just slightly, its grip on being the only possible version of itself. People rarely notice this, but the nightly dissolution of ordinary consciousness, the slow drift towards sleep, the loosening of the day's identity, the quiet return to something prior to the self, is not a loss, it is a homecoming. The self that wakes tomorrow will be rested, not just biologically, but philosophically, having spent a few hours outside the story, having returned, even briefly, to the ground beneath the narrative. The excavation is complete for tonight. There is nothing left to understand, nothing left to solve, nothing left to improve or examine or hold up to the light. Tonight has given what it has to give, and it has been enough, and now it is asking only one thing of you, to sleep. So let the body be heavy now. Let the thoughts slow to the pace of the breath. Let the breath slow to the pace of the dark. Let the dark be what it is, not a void, not a threat, not a waiting room for tomorrow's anxieties, but a gentle, ancient, utterly reliable rest. The same dark that held every human being who ever lived through every night they ever doubted they would survive. The same quiet that waited on the other side of every difficulty anyone, anywhere, has ever carried into bed and woken to find slightly smaller in the morning light. You are held by more than you know, by the long, patient, imperfect, beautiful lineage of every human mind that ever sat with these same questions in the dark and found, not answers, but something better. The companionship of the question itself. The recognition that to be uncertain, to be anxious, to be searching, these are not failures. They are the evidence of a consciousness that is genuinely, courageously, fully alive. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. Nothing needs to be different than it is. The anxiety can rest now. It has worked very hard, and it can put down its tools, and it can rest. And you, the real you, the quiet one, the one that was here before the worry and will be here after, you can rest too. Let the thoughts go where thoughts go when the mind finally releases them. Somewhere gentle, somewhere soft, somewhere beyond the reach of tomorrow's agenda. The night is yours. The quiet is yours. The slow, deepening dark is yours. You are always going to be okay. You still are. Sleep now. The room is very quiet now. If there are sounds around you, a fan, rain, the distant soft movement of the world continuing, let them carry you rather than wake you. You don't need to hold on to anything from tonight. The ideas will still be there tomorrow, patient as they always are. The only thing asked of you in this moment is the simplest and most ancient thing. Let go. Let the body be heavy, and the mind be soft, and the breath be slow. You came here carrying something. You don't have to carry it any further tonight. Somewhere in the long, luminous tradition of human beings who sat with their anxiety in the dark and found their way through it, you belong. You have always belonged. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are. Sweet dreams.